I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon. This is episode number 207, and today on the show, I'm joined by Whit Fosburgh of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership to discuss possibly the largest private lands conservation bill in America and how it impacts hunters. And that, of course, is the Farm Bill. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Sitka Gear. And today on the show, we are talking about private lands conservation. You know, we hear so much about these big conservation initiatives related to public lands, but of course, conservation is important on private land too. And for most of us whitetail hunters, especially those of us that are hunting east of the Mississippi, it's private land really that most of us depend on. You know, public land, of course, is still super important, but to be honest, I think the numbers do clearly show that most of us whitetail guys are private land hunters the majority of the time. But you just don't hear a whole lot about the stuff that's going on to protect and improve and conserve those areas. But that doesn't mean there's not stuff going on, and that's why we're doing today's podcast, because there is actually an absolutely huge private lands conservation bill that's up for debate this year. And we hunters and our voices, we're going to be needed to make sure this bill positively impacts fish and wildlife in wild places. And this bill is the Farm Bill. You've probably heard of it, but if you're not kind of deeply tapped into the conservation world, you may not really realize that the Farm Bill doesn't just have to do with farmers. It actually covers a vast array of different issues, including a whole lot of stuff related to habitat and wildlife and hunters. So today, to help make sense of this massive bill and all of its implications on hunting and wildlife and habitat, we're going to be joined by Whit Fosburgh of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And I know what you're thinking. The Farm Bill, this sounds like a snooze fest. And yes, I mean, this isn't going to be quite as fun maybe as a deep dive conversation into hunting strategies or some big, whitetail or Alaskan adventure. We're not going to have that conversation. But as we have talked about many times here on the podcast, we hunters, we do have a responsibility. Hunting is a consumptive activity, meaning that we take from the landscape that we recreate on. And if we're going to take something from these wild places and wild animals, whether that's taking a life or a week's worth of rest and relaxation or a lifelong memory or maybe just a pile of mushrooms or antlers, if we're taking something, it's our responsibility to give back too. And it's not always going to be fun. It's not always going to be easy. It's not always what we want to talk about. But it is on us to give back and make sure that these places and animals and opportunities are available in the future. And so that is why I think these kinds of conversations and issues are so important for us as a hunting community, and even just as like our little tight podcast family here. It's important for us to spend some time on this stuff, I believe, too. So today, that's what we're going to do. And I commend you, and if I could, I'd high-five you or shake your hand for taking the time to dig into this one with an open mind and some curiosity. The Farm Bill is jam-packed with programs that can positively impact us hunters if they're funded and approved. And we've got that opportunity this year to make sure that happens. So stick with me here today, learn a bit about the Farm Bill, maybe make a few calls or emails, and then we can get right back into big, rutting, stinky bucks and wild adventures in the great outdoors and all that kind of good stuff. Does that sound good? Good. All right, then we're going to take a quick break for our Sitka story of the day, and then I'll bring Whit on the line with me to dive into private lands conservation and the Farm Bill.
For this week's Sitka story, we're joined by Don Vidash, who tells us about an eye-opening encounter he had in southeastern Kansas.
Well, Spencer, it's an interesting... The Sitka stories have been intriguing to me. I'm an avid follower of the podcast, and I've had a couple defining moments in my own career, and one really was an eye-opener for me. Back in 2015, I had a particularly large buck that I was after in Kansas, probably the biggest one I had ever chased, and had a lot of camera pictures of him, and was really waiting him out, and got down to Kansas just on a great cold front in November, and got into where I thought he would be, and sure enough, around 11:30 a.m., he comes walking in into the field I was sitting in with a few does, and I snort wheezed at him, just trying to get aggressive, and he took one look over at me and just came charging in like a bull. Stopped staring at me head on at 10 yards, eyeball to eyeball, and it was one of those moments where your camouflage really gets tested, and right about then he looked away and took one step, and that was one of his last. And for me, that was really one of those moments where you wonder how things are working, and I had the wind in my face, and I just knew at that time that the camouflage was working for me. As hunters, I think we always have questions. Is my wind good? Is my setup good? Is my equipment solid? And in that moment, I knew that all that was clicking.
On Don's hunt, which was a bitterly cold sit, he was wearing Sitka's phonetic system. If you'd like to create a Sitka story of your own, or to learn more about Sitka's technical hunting apparel, visit sitkagear.com.
All right, with us now is Whit Fosburgh from the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Thanks for being with us, Whit.
Mark, always great to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I got to tell you, the work you guys are doing, for me personally, I found it so beneficial. When I first discovered what you guys are up to, maybe, 5-6 years ago, maybe, and since I've started following just the information, the resources you guys put out through your newsletter and your website, I don't know how people could learn about this stuff and understand what's going on in the hunting and fishing conservation world if you guys weren't doing what you do. So just big thank you from me right off the get-go for doing such helpful work.
Well, we appreciate that. And, you talk about one of the problems, which is there are so many different things that are going on, and a lot of them are so complicated that, the average, hunter out there looks at it and they just, sort of eyes glaze over and you don't pay much attention. And so that's what we get paid to do, is to work on to make sure that somebody is paying attention. And just so your listeners understand, we're a coalition of about 56 different organizations, from Mule Deer Foundation and National Deer Alliance to Fences Forever and Ducks Unlimited, but also Outdoor Industry Association and AFL-CIO, because 70% of their 12 million members hunt and fish. And what we try to do is really bring all those diverse voices together to speak in a common voice on the big issues affecting hunting and fishing and conservation in America, like, public lands policy or agriculture policy.
Yeah, and I think that's what you just said right there. Agriculture policy was what I was hoping we could focus on today, because I think that a lot of people are aware of what's going on with conservation in relation to public lands. There's been a lot of talk lately over the last several years about what's happening with our public lands and some of the different things we need to be aware of on that front. But when it comes to private land stuff, which is what most deer hunters, especially east of the Mississippi, are dealing with, we don't talk about a whole lot. We kind of just talk about at least the average deer hunter is talking about maybe what kind of habitat work we can do on our own properties to help deer. But there's not a whole lot of talk about some of the bigger picture programs or regulations or anything like that impacts all of us across the country when it comes to private land conservation. And I know that the Farm Bill is a big piece of that. So, Whit, I'm hoping today you can help us understand what is this thing, what is this beast of legislation, why does it matter? And I guess maybe before I ramble any further, can we start right there? Can you just tell us what is the Farm Bill? Why does it matter for deer hunters?
Yeah, so I mean, you're exactly right. A lot of our attention is sort of applied to big, sexy issues like public lands policy and things like that. But 70% of this country is in private land ownership, and about half of that is in agricultural production or commercial timber production. And so, the stats I've seen is about somewhere around 70% of the hunters out there hunt on private lands predominantly. And so it makes a really big difference. And the Farm Bill actually dates all the way back to the Depression and Franklin Roosevelt. And it was part of his efforts to really stabilize, the collapse in the farming economy and the Dust Bowl and all that at that time by creating incentives for, landowners to do the right things by their lands. It's evolved since the 1930s, and really the conservation parts of the Farm Bill began in the 1980s. And there were sort of two goals there. One, we were seeing, a rapid decline in, wetlands and prairie habitat and, things like that. So there was a conservation need. We also were in a crisis in the farm states where prices were low and you were seeing, small farmers just getting out of business. And so it was sort of, one part, doing the right thing for conservation and one part basically a price support program for the farmers to set aside land, not farm it, and get a payment for it. And that was a way of keeping them in business. And I think that nobody at that time really knew just how beneficial it was going to be. But, as the results came in, as we saw sort of huge rebounds in pheasant populations and duck populations and whitetails and turkeys and a lot of the other things we like to chase, people really started to understand and expand upon, the conservation side of the Farm Bill. And, in the sort of grown up and down over time, and the last Farm Bill was in 2014, and at that time we saw a cut in the conservation programs. We saw a cut in the overall Farm Bill. Every program pretty much in there was reduced in some fashion, but there was a big cut, about a $3 billion cut in the conservation side. And it's still, even with that, today we're spending about $5.7 billion through the Farm Bill to promote conservation on private lands, which really makes it the single largest conservation program in this country. And about 50 million acres out there are enrolled in some conservation program or another. So it has a huge impact. There are a few different. One thing important to understand about the Farm Bill is it's all about voluntary incentives for conservation. This is the non-regulatory approach to conservation, and a lot of people get ticked off when they think about EPA or various other regulatory programs, all of which are necessary. But for private landowners out there, they don't want to be threatened. They want to see if we can be in partnership with the government to do the right thing. And one of the things we saw in the 2014 Farm Bill was, the conservation side since the 1980s had really grown, and programs, all sorts of different programs had popped up to the point where it was getting really complicated for the individual landowner about, should I enroll in this or that? And so as a way of reducing some of the costs of the programs, a lot of that was consolidated in 2014. So went down to much more than half the programs were, sort of evolved and moved into other programs that were existing, which actually makes it, I think, a lot easier if you're a landowner out there to participate. And then, that was where a lot of that $3 billion worth of savings were in the 2018 Farm Bill. Now, as we're looking at the 2014 Farm Bill, as we're looking at 2018, we have a very different landscape today than we did 4 years ago. At that time, corn prices, wheat prices, soybean prices, pretty much at record highs. And it was very hard for the conservation programs to compete, with somebody who's planting those, turning those field into row crops. It was just so lucrative for the farm folks back then. we have a very different situation today. Prices are low. Farmers out there are not doing well right now, and they're clamoring to get into the conservation programs. But a lot of those programs, like the Conservation Reserve Program, got capped in 2014. So CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, is probably one of the most famous programs out there. If you're a deer hunter, you probably know about it. If you're a pheasant hunter, you definitely know about it. But this is a lot of the program folks can enroll to take, the idea of highly erodible areas out of production, and also sensitive, environmental areas. So let's say stream corridors on a field, deep, steep slopes that were really pretty marginal for planting in the first place. A lot of those areas got entered into CRP, not only just to sort of go wild, but then, there are also incentives to, produce, put in, for example, seed mixes for pollinators and for other species. And that just made, tremendously good habitat. That program was at its height about 37 million acres around the country. And a farmer enters into it, and they get a payment, and they make a commitment of 10 to 15 years to not, basically plow up that land and keep it in conservation and manage it. And, so from 37 million acres at its height, it went down to 24 million acres in 2014. Not because anybody in Congress was evil or didn't like conservation. The bottom line was it was really hard to compete with high commodity prices. So this was a way of saving money because people weren't enrolling anyway. So, but today, as I mentioned, it's a very different situation. We're trying to get that number up into the 30s, 32, 35 million acres, because there's plenty of demand for that. And if you can add, 8, 10 million acres into good conservation and good habitat, that has direct application to hunting and fishing. So that's the sort of short take of where we are. It's probably worth talking a little bit about the different types of programs that we have in the Farm Bill. One is, we just mentioned, Conservation Reserve Program, which a lot of folks are familiar with. There are longer-term easement programs where you basically set aside, really, sensitive areas, in perpetuity, and obviously you get a lot more money for that. But that's really an idea of, not having to just sort of keep writing a check every, 10 years, but areas we know should never be, put back under the plow, getting them off. There are other programs like the, what's known as the EQIP program that will fund things like improving your irrigation system so you use less water, and, in the same time, you return some of that saved water to the stream, which is great for fish, or just irrigate a little more sensitively. Programs like that are more, sort of fixes with, actually going in there and turning over some dirt and putting in structures, but that's all eligible under the Farm Bill too. One of the cool things that we did in 2008 is we added a public access program to the Farm Bill, and it's known as the Voluntary Public Access Habitat Improvement Program. And it was really actually the brainchild of TRCP's founder, a guy named Jim Range. And he had always thought that this was a great way of promoting conservation, but also expanding public access. Because, as loss of access is, if not the number one, is certainly one of the top 2 reasons that people stop hunting and fishing.
Yeah.
And so Jim recognized that if we could create some incentives for private landowners, not only to do good things for conservation, but also to open those lands to public hunting and fishing, it would be a win-win for everybody. So in 2008, a pilot program got put in, but the VPA HIP is the more official title for it. It got expanded into a $50 million program in the 2014 Farm Bill, and it has just been a phenomenal success. I mean, not only has it supplemented, states that have traditional walk-in programs like Kansas and Montana, but it has, created incentives for states like Massachusetts and Connecticut to create these walk-in programs. And it's, we think in the first, that first section of the Farm Bill, from the 2008 Farm Bill, it added about 3 million acres of private land to public access. And the way that works is, a state applies for a grant from the Department of Agriculture, say $1 million. It gets it, and then it uses that money to go out and enter into individual contract with willing landowners. And so the landowners get a payment in exchange for the state promises to put up the signage, monitor access, and also the state assumes liability. So if somebody, steps in a ditch and breaks their leg, the landowner doesn't have to worry about being sued. That program, again, was expanded to $50 million in the 2014 Farm Bill. According to our friends at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, they say that demand right now could easily fill a program's $150 million, which would add millions of more acres of private land to public hunting and fishing. And so we've had bills dropped in the House and the Senate just on that one program, bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, that would expand that to a $150 million program. So, in addition to the good things for conservation, we also have a direct tie to public access in the Farm Bill through the VPA HIP program.
How do hunters find where these places are? I feel like a lot of people don't even realize that these kinds of programs are in place in a lot of states. And to your point, access is such a challenge for so many of us. Where do they get the info, and what all states do utilize this program?
Well, it's funny because every state has their own way of advertising it, and that's actually been one of my pet peeves. Is there's not one. If I'm flying into Pierce, South Dakota to go pheasant hunting, I can't sort of click on my access app and all of a sudden have pop up all around me these walk-in areas and what the rules are with them. So what you got to do now is you got to go to the individual state websites and find out about it. So like in your state of Michigan, it's the hunting access program. And what you'll do is you'll go in there and you Google that, and it will tell you where those areas are and if there are any special rules associated with them. In Illinois, it's called the Illinois Recreational Access Program, or IRAP. In Iowa, it's the Illinois Habitat and Access Program, IHAP. And so every state calls it something a little bit different. Block grant programs, and that's what it's called in some states. So what you really just got to do is go to your state agency's website, Google it, and find out where these areas are. There will be maps. You can click on them. They should pop up and tell you about where the access points are and if there are any special rules and regs about going on them. But it's a really good program right now, and what we're trying to do is get that expanded and also make sure that it's targeted. For example, if you target some of those areas that, say, abut a national forest, then you can get access to those, but you can also then get access to the national forest behind it, which may have been inaccessible to most hunters. I mean, you think about how for example, in the West, how development happened. And that is, the private landowners took all the good land down at the river bottoms, and then, the mountains behind them, that's where the national forests are. And in the old days, you could always just knock on someone's door, walk across their land, and, go hunt in the national forest. And that has changed. People are afraid of liability. A rich, Silicon Valley billionaire has, bought that parcel and popped up no trespassing signs. So we have lost a lot of access, not only to private land, but to public lands that traditionally could be accessed but no longer can be. And so if you use something like either these programs, the voluntary public access programs of the Farm Bill, you can really be using them strategically to access some of those lands that have become inaccessible.
Right. So here's the question I've got about this kind of thing, because the voluntary public access portion of this, it seems like such a home run, such a no-brainer benefit especially to hunters. But the question is, how do we help with something like this? Because, and this is maybe a larger question too, but when you look at the Farm Bill, it seems to be this convoluted combination of all these different programs and pieces and parts. But then you also see things like this program that are getting talked about even outside of the Farm Bill. I think that you guys call this a marker bill. I was reading about how recently, just recently, a handful of congressmen proposed some updates to this. I think just this last week about some updates for this new version of the VPA. So how does that work, and how do we hunters say, yes, we really want this, we want this expanded? Do we need to work on it right now because of this new proposal, or do we wait until the Farm Bill debates are really happening?
So that's a great question, and the Farm Bill debates are happening right now. And the way the Farm Bill works, it has so many diverse programs. I mean, the food stamp program in this country is under the Farm Bill. In addition to crop insurance, in addition to the conservation payments. So there is a ton that goes on. The way it often happens is that individual portions of the Farm Bill, members will break them off, introduce what we call marker bills, and that's where they can be discussed and they can be modified, because once everything's put together, it's so big and it's hard to get your arms around. You do a lot of that sort of, I'll say negotiating and fine-tuning with these marker bills. And then assuming you build some good bipartisan support and you take care of any unanticipated problems, then hopefully that becomes what gets moved into the bigger Farm Bill. So as you just mentioned, we have now Senate versions and House versions of a new voluntary public access bill. And the main change in it is that it's just a bigger bill. It goes from $50 million to $150 million. And we think it's going to have broad bipartisan support. The Senate bill was, Senator Bennett, Democrat from Colorado, Senator Crapo, Republican from Idaho, 4 members, including Debbie Dingell from Michigan, were the co-sponsors in the House side. Anyone can go to our website, which is trcp.org, and click on our Farm Bill stuff, and they get all the details. But first, thank the folks that have introduced this. 2, urge your own congressperson to get in there and support this program and broadly support conservation in the Farm Bill. The challenge that we're going to be under is, especially now that Congress has done the tax bill, they've approved a 2-year budget that spends a ton of money. There is going to be a lot more pressure than usual on the Farm Bill to cut money, and because there are a few folks out there that actually think deficits still matter, and they see the Farm Bill as a giant chunk of cash. And what we don't want to see happen is a lot of these conservation programs be the ones that get sacrificed in exchange for spending in other areas. So I'd say 2 things. 1, argue for the voluntary public access program expansion in the whatever House or the Senate Farm Bill, and 2, really push back on the notion of cuts to conservation. If anything, we ought to be doubling down on conservation. A couple of points here. I mean, we obviously, on this administration, does not like the idea of EPA and regulatory enforcement, which is fine. But if you're not going to go out there and enforce things to regulation, you better double down on voluntary incentives to do the right things. And areas like programs like the Farm Bill, with its the grasslands programs, wetlands programs, CRP, all the rest. I mean, those are natural programs to improve water quality. So if you don't like dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, in Lake Erie, off the coast of Florida, other places, you need to double down on these voluntary incentives for conservation. And so I think that, and I also would argue, and I think that the economics back this up, that these aren't just handouts to farmers. I mean, these are good for local economies. I mean, I remember when the walk-in program was first started in Kansas, and it was years ago, and it brought so many people that came to the state to go pheasant hunting, and there were so many ripple effects to the economy. Motel rooms, diners, sporting goods shops, you name it. All of a sudden, the counties were sending checks to the state government to expand those areas because they saw what it was doing locally for the economy. I don't know if you noticed, but this past week, the Bureau of Economic Analysis released statistics on the outdoor recreation economy in this country, and it is massive. And hunting and fishing play a really big part in that. And so I would argue that any investments we make in conservation and expanding hunting and fishing are also investments in our economy.
Yeah. So zooming back, I guess, a little bit, excuse me, zooming out, you talked a little bit about this as far as what you think might be going on with the current administration, some of these pressures, but can you speak a little more on what the overall prognosis is, coming into the 2018 debate? Do we feel good about what's happening, or is this like an area that we are concerned about and the hunting and fishing community really needs to get into action here and make sure that we don't have any negative outcomes?
Well, I mean, one thing that having been around this town for a very long time has told us is you never take anything for granted. And the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So I think we're in a pretty good place with the Farm Bill moving forward. But unless, members of Congress hear from constituents like ours that care about conservation, that care about public access, they're going to be hearing a whole lot from commodity groups. They're going to be hearing a whole lot from other folks that have vested interests in this. And our job is to make sure that our voices are heard as well, and not in a shrill way, but using facts, talking about water quality, talking about local economic impact, talking about how important these programs are to getting our kids away from the TV screen or their video games and out into the field. And I think, nobody can assume that somebody else is making that case. We all need to weigh in on this one.
Fair enough. So what are some of the other programs? You were going through the list of the different pieces of this. What's next?
Yeah, there's a variety of things. The big ones in the Farm Bill, there's what we call ASEP, or the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. And that's the one we talked about that, allows these larger parcels to be preserved, long term. We have the Conservation Reserve Program, which are short term, 10, 15 years tops, contracts to take land out of production. And ideally, some of the, higher quality, or less high quality agricultural areas, but important ecologically, stream corridors, highly erodible areas, places like that. We have the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP. And I mentioned that one, that is, there have been a whole lot of wildlife investments on that one. I use the example of converting an irrigation system to make it a little more fish friendly. But there are a bunch of other things that can be done under that. A new program that was created in the 2014 Farm Bill was something called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP. And the idea there was to really target conservation investments on large-scale watersheds, or large-scale areas. But in the past, the conservation part of the Farm Bill could sort of be considered thousands of acts of random kindness. RCPP was an idea of let's get folks, diverse interests, conservation groups, farm groups, conservation districts, others in a big watershed or a big area, so let's say the Upper Missouri watershed in Montana, something like that, and get them all working together and create public-private partnerships to really make sure that we're having a broader impact on what we're doing. It's not just isolated parcels, but it's really affecting entire landscapes. That is a program that's, because it was new, there were some bugs in it, and we're getting those worked out, but that's something that really requires additional investment moving forward. I mentioned the Voluntary Public Access Program, which is the public access part of the Farm Bill. And then really the last big one that is in sort of our, that I think that your listeners really should care about is something called conservation compliance. And this is where we sort of morph a little bit into the regulatory side. So we went away from, in the previous Farm Bill, sort of direct payments to landowners to subsidize their production. Instead, we basically said, you'll get a payment if your crop fails. You're not going to get a payment if you're doing fine, and which makes sense. So that's crop insurance. But in order for that to work, it has to be linked to conservation. And so otherwise, you have an incentive to go up there and dig up and plant the worst land on your farm, knowing that it's probably going to fail, but who cares, because you're going to get a payment from crop insurance because it failed. Now, that is just bad public policy, and it's bad for fish and wildlife, so it was really controversial. We managed to get it in the 2014 Farm Bill, which is relinking conservation compliance with crop insurance. So today, you can go up and you can plow up those areas, but you're not going to be eligible for a crop insurance payment, and which is plenty of incentive to keep folks from basically plowing up those areas that should never get plowed up. So we've got part of the ag community is after those and wants to see that taken away because they see that as too much intrusion on how they do business. In my mind, it is basic good governance that we do not want to be subsidizing bad practices. And so to the extent that your listeners want to weigh in on conservation compliance and make sure that that remains linked to crop insurance, that is a really important program too.
That's good to know. So we've got CRP, which is incentivizing landowners to develop better habitat for wildlife, and it's an incentive, so they're benefiting from it too. We've got the voluntary access programs. We've got easement programs that preserve areas long term. We've got ways to help landowners better comply with some of the things that are going to protect some of these places. There's a whole bunch of different pieces of this pie, and you spoke to this a little bit when it came to the voluntary access standpoint, how we can be calling our representatives and supporting that. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is we can call our representatives, we can email our representatives, but is there any kind of focused targeted other actions that we should be taking? You know, sometimes there's petitions or different things like that for specific aspects. Is there anything like that?
Yeah, you can go on. There are a couple of things. We've got first of all, there is a whole, sportsman's priorities for conservation and access in the 2018 Farm Bill. It's a publication we produced. If you go to trcp.org/Farm Bill, you will find it, and it will be all our detailed recommendations for what we want to see out of the Farm Bill. And it's not just us. I mean, there are 24 different groups that are part of our agricultural working group. Groups that really care about these things. It's a very diverse group. I mean, it ranges from the American Fisheries Society to the Association of State Fish and Wildlife Agencies and Ducks Unlimited, but also from Trout Unlimited, Wildlife Society, Wildlife Management Institute, Western Landowners Alliance. So it is very much the the big picture, and this is basically our collective vision of what needs to happen in the Farm Bill. So folks can go to that, and then they can get much more detail and figure out how to contact their congressman and all the rest. There is another specific site that we have called CRP Works, and that is a dedicated website just about CRP, and it has petition and sign up, and you get more information. And because CRP is such an important part of the Farm Bill for our community, we have created a separate site there. So those will give you, I think, any listeners that want to go on, we'll give them places and really show how they can take action on this. But the key thing is really just to take action. Don't assume that somebody else is doing this stuff for you.
That's definitely important. And I guess one more time I want to just double check on timing. Is there a time that is the very most impactful?
Any time now is a good time because, we think the House of Representatives is going to put in a Farm Bill within the next couple of weeks. They're going to drop their big bill. Senate will not be far behind. We are told that, they're going to try to move this before the, summer recess, which is basically the end of July, beginning of August. And that's going to come pretty fast. So we'll have a better idea in the next few weeks about what's in the various bills, and we'll have more sort of specific advice to give to our members, our supporters, our partner groups. If any of your folks want to just sign up sign up on our site, they're going to get weekly updates as to what's moving through Congress and what they can do. So I would say that is the first step. But, I think that, the Farm Bill is unlike any other program really in Congress because it is not a partisan bill. It generally breaks down along geographic lines much more than Republican Democratic lines. And in a year when, any time when Congress wants to show it can bring home the bacon, it tries to pass farm bills in election years. Because with the end, we don't have earmarks anymore. This is one way that they can really show they've brought something back to folks that matter in their states. And the reason that the Farm Bill passes is because there is an alliance between urban members and rural members. The urban members get their nutrition assistance, their food stamps. The rural members get their price programs, get their conservation programs. So we don't want to be doing is going in there and railing against food stamps or something, because this is part of the coalition that keeps the Farm Bill alive and viable. Because if we ever break off just rural America versus urban America, we are screwed. Mm-hmm. And so, folks need to remember that. Set the politics aside, focus on the Farm Bill, and really push for something to get done, sooner rather than later. And I think that we're hearing a lot from the farm community, and especially the small farmers out there that are under a lot of financial stress right now. They're very supportive of the Farm Bill and the conservation programs because they see it as a way if they can ride out these tough times, whereas maybe 4 years ago they thought they didn't need the conservation programs. That has changed. So I think the timing is really good to get something that's positive with this Farm Bill. But just D.C. is so dysfunctional these days that you just can't assume anything.
Yeah, can't take anything for granted these days.
No.
Well, this is great though, because I think that when people hear the Farm Bill, if they don't know anything about it, they just assume, unless they're a farmer themselves, they assume it has nothing to do with me. And then if they do realize that there is some benefits within it to the hunting and fishing and outdoor community, they just might get confused by the whole alphabet soup of all the different programs and acronyms, and it's just kind of a murky swamp to wade through. So I'm glad you broke it down by a few of the most important programs that we can kind of wrap our heads around, and the action items I think are clear. I want to shift gears to one final alphabet soup acronym here that's not in the Farm Bill, but I do want to touch on this, and that's the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
Sure.
Because I know this is something that is up for debate again this year. Can you fill us in on the latest with LWCF? And maybe for those that aren't familiar, really quick, what is it, why is it important, and then what's happening right now?
Well, it's a great question, and this is another hugely important federal program for sportsmen's access. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund was created in 1965, and it was a deal basically between the oil and gas industry and conservation interests. And so the deal was we're going to open up the Outer Continental Shelf to oil and gas development. In exchange, the oil and gas industry will pay in $900 million a year into a fund, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that will be used to protect at-risk natural areas through acquisition, through easement. The program also supports state parks, so there's a local benefit as well. And it was a great compromise, and really the way governing is supposed to work, and it passed essentially unanimously in the Senate. In the 50-plus years since the Land and Water Conservation Fund was created, only one time has it been fully funded. Instead, Congress gets all those receipts, or the federal government gets all those receipts, but Congress decides, well, we're actually going to hijack that money and put it someplace else. So in a typical year, you may get $300, $400 million going into the fund, which is still a lot of money. It's a lot less money than it was in 1965, but it's still important for doing targeted acquisitions, for easement programs, for parks. Initially, it had a 50-year authorization. That expired 3 years ago. We got a 3-year extension. In theory, this program is no longer authorized at the end of September this year. So we want really two things. One, we want it reauthorized. And two, we want it fully funded. You'll hear complaints of some folks, well, gosh, the federal government can't take care of the land it has. Why should we add more to it? A couple of responses to that. First of all, a relatively small part of this is acquisition. A lot more of it is easements. And it's just keeping very important areas from getting developed. I mean, we're not making any more land. And as you know, as I know, living around here in D.C., the march of sprawl is relentless. And the places that, I could hunt when I was a kid, are now, full-fledged, shopping malls, subdivisions, all the rest. So LWCF is really important for protecting some of those special places. It's all done through willing sellers. There's no condemnation that goes in there. And it's also incredibly important, I mentioned before, like in part of connecting, off-limits public lands through to the public again. So Land and Water Conservation Fund is one of those things that we can use to go in there and do that easement on a 1,000-acre ranch at the foothills of some mountains that then connects the public with an area that it can no longer get to go hunting. So there are all sorts of benefits with this. There was a cool piece, I think it was in one of the outdoor rags, I think Field and Stream or Outdoor Life, that talked about a world record bighorn that was shot not too long ago in an island in Montana, and that island was bought with LWCF funds. And so it's things like that. This is a mom and apple pie program for sportsmen. And it is, again, just another one of these sort of travesties of the way we run our government, that this money was set aside for this purpose and is not being used for that purpose. And it's billions of dollars that should have gone into conservation over the past 50 years have been subverted for other things. And we ought to just be putting our foot down and saying that this is incredibly important. It's not just incredibly important for hunting and fishing and water quality, but for bird watching and hiking. And this is one of those programs that has really broad bipartisan support from conservation interests. But there are some, basically, the same folks that really don't like public lands and want to get rid of the public lands are dead set in fighting, this program.
So then, it like you said, every time I hear about this, every time I read something about this, it just seems like such a no-brainer, positive. What's the action that we need to take to make sure that we don't see this cut or not reauthorized or not refunded?
Contact your congressman, contact the Trump administration, and say that the Land and Water Conservation Fund is an incredibly important program for sportsmen, and that Congress ought to reauthorize it and fully fund it.
Perfect. Simple enough, right?
Very simple.
All right.
And again, you can go to our website and you'll find out lots more about that. In fact, we did a report that's on our website a few years ago, just laid out 10 examples of how Land and Water Conservation Fund has been used for great sportsman's access programs.
Excellent. Well, Whit, while we have you, I guess, is there anything else that is top of your mind that we need to be knowing about that's happening right now in D.C. or elsewhere pertaining to deer hunters or public land or overall conservation? Anything else that we need to be keeping our eyes on?
Yeah, there's a cool thing that was announced out of the Department of the Interior, Secretary Zinke, a couple of weeks ago, and it's a big emphasis on migration corridors. And listen, I've been very critical of Secretary Zinke. I mean, I was a big supporter of his when he came in, but felt that he had just sort of bent over backwards to open up areas of development and had done nothing for conservation since then. But to his credit, they announced a new executive order to require all the agencies within the Department of the Interior to work together to protect and strengthen migration corridors. And, we have sportsmen know that animals migrate, and, hell, my hunting place is my camp is in the Adirondacks, and, the whitetails out of there migrate out of our place every year down to, an area 20 plus miles away where they basically overwinter. In places like Montana, there's new research on mule deer migrations. And there have been, National Geographic and others have covered really cool stuff. The path of pronghorn. We know a lot more than we used to know about these migration corridors, so you can preserve a lot of these big game species pretty simply by targeting, let's keep development out of these corridors. Let's really focus on, working with the states and private landowners to fix some fencing problems we might have. If we have an overpass or an underpass that needs to go in a highway, let's work with the Department of Transportation on that. I mean, it's really a no-brainer, but, until this executive order that came out, there really never been an emphasis from the Department of the Interior to focus on that. So I think that's worth noting, and I think that's something that's really cool, and we hope that it becomes more than just a executive order, that some real meat gets put on those bones, and that's something great for the hunting community.
Yeah, I agree. When I saw that was good news that I was glad to see. All right, so final question then, Whit. And you mentioned it already, but I just want to give you an opportunity to do so one more time. Where can people go to follow what you guys are doing, to get more information like this, and to stay up to date?
Yeah, just we don't do a magazine or anything like that, so everything that we have is on our website, and that's trcp.org. And if you sign up there, you will get a weekly update, on, what's going on in Congress. You'll have some fun stuff, too. I think our website does a really good job, and there are a variety of things. You go through it. We have a site on, just pushing back against the takeover of public lands. We have another site called sportsmanscountry.org. It's a petition site that really calls on sportsmen to weigh in on how do we, making sure we better manage the lands we have. That's better forest management to, better, facilities, from everything from campgrounds to roads to trails. But you will see if you go through that site that if you're a sportsman, there's going to be something in there that's interesting to you. And if you have questions, we also have a staff directory there, and you just click on somebody's name and get their email address and send them a note and just ask some more questions. And if you we have some great premiums from some of our friends like Sitka and First Light and others, and feel free to write a check and get something cool.
There you go. Well, I said it at the beginning, and I'll say it again. I personally check your guys' site almost daily. It's some of the very best stuff out there to help us keep track of what's happening. So I highly recommend anyone, if you're not already signed up for that newsletter, if you're not already checking out their blog and their website, you really should do it. So, Whit, keep up the great work, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, Mark, keep up your great work, too, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And that's it for us today, folks. A short one, but interesting and important stuff. And part of the reason why this is a quick one and why there wasn't the long intro is because actually right now, if you're listening to this when this podcast drops, I am actually out in North Dakota. I mentioned this on last week's episode, but I'm out there right now shed hunting and scouting and figuring some stuff out there in western North Dakota with my buddy Ferder and my dog Boone, and having a grand old time, hopefully. And if you're interested in following along with that trip, you can check out, assuming that I've got internet service where I'm at, which hopefully I will, I'll be posting lots of updates on the Wired to Hunt Instagram account and we're going to try to do semi-live YouTube videos while we're out there documenting the adventure. So head on over to the Wired to Hunt YouTube channel, check out what we've posted so far, and if for some reason we don't have that service, I'll be posting all these videos when I get home, which should be soon. So thanks for checking those out. And then finally, want to give a big thank you to our partners who help make all of this possible. So big thanks to Sitka Gear, Yeti Coolers, Matthews Archery, Maven Optics, the Whitetail Institute of North America, Trophy Ridge, and Huntera Maps. And of course, thank you all for listening. I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate you paying attention and, stepping up to help out on some of these types of issues. We couldn't do this kind of stuff without you guys. Your support, your interest, your energy is what fuels this podcast, and it's what fuels the future of hunting in this country, in this continent. So big props to all of you. Thanks for being awesome, and stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. You ever get that feeling the walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating you? You crave some wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe in a spot all your own. Well, head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, streams, you name it. Search by acreage. You can search by location. You can search by the kind of hunting and fishing you're dreaming of. Land.com. It is where the adventure begins.